What if I told you the most important financial shift in Africa today is not a crisis, not a collapse, but something far more unsettling for the global system? Before we begin, let me take a moment to greet all my brothers and sisters across Africa and across the world. May you have strength, stability, and unity in these changing times. Because what we are about to discuss is not just about numbers. It is about the future of a continent and the balance of power that many believed would never change. For decades, the story was simple. Money flowed into Africa. Loans arrived. Aid packages were announced. Experts spoke with confidence about development, about growth, about what Africa needed next. And the world accepted one quiet assumption, that Africa would always need more. But now, something has changed. For the first time in years, more money is leaving Africa than entering it. And strangely, nothing is breaking. No emergency broadcasts, no collapsing currencies, no chaos in the streets. Instead, there is silence. A silence that makes analysts uncomfortable. Because when money flows out of a system that was built on constant inflow, it raises a question no one wants to answer directly. Is this a sign of failure? Or is it a sign that something has finally been completed? You see, in places like Burkina Faso, across the Sahel, and throughout Africa, the ground reality is shifting. Infrastructure that once existed only in speeches is now visible. Systems that once depended on promises are now operating. And when systems begin to operate, they begin to pay. So let me ask you something. Wherever you are listening from today, if Africa is no longer waiting for money to arrive, if Africa is now sending money back, then what does that mean for the world that was built on the opposite expectation? Stay with me, because the answer to that question may change how you understand Africa, and what comes next may surprise you. To truly understand why money is now leaving Africa, we need to step back for a moment, back to a time when the flow was moving in the opposite direction. Because this story did not begin today. It began more than a decade ago, when a new player entered the African continent with a very different approach. In the late 2000s, China was facing a growing problem. Its economy was expanding at an incredible pace. But that growth came with a hidden vulnerability. Its factories depended on raw materials from far away. Its exports depended on shipping routes it did not control. Its energy supply depended on choke points that could be disruptive. This was not just an economic issue. It was a strategic risk. And Africa sat outside that risk map. So when China came to Africa, it did not come with speeches about aid or development in the traditional sense. It came with engineers. It came with financing. It came with timelines. Ports were expanded to move goods faster. Railways were built to connect inland resources directly to the coast. Power plants were constructed to stabilize energy supply. Digital networks were laid to create new communication routes. And after 2013, under what became known globally as the Belt and Road Initiative, this expansion accelerated. Billions of dollars flowed into African nations. Projects appeared across the continent at a scale and speed that had rarely been seen before. But here is the part that many observers misunderstood at the time. Those loans were never designed to stay open forever. They were structured with a life cycle, a beginning, a middle, and an end. First came construction, then operation, then revenue generation, and finally, repayment. For years, Africa was in the first phase, building. Money flowed in. Projects were incomplete. Systems were still dependent. But today, we are no longer in that phase. Across multiple regions, including countries like Burkina Faso and its neighbors in the Sahel, infrastructure is no longer a promise. It is functioning. Trains are moving goods. Ports are collecting fees. Electricity is being generated and sold. And once these systems begin to generate revenue, something fundamental changes. They no longer need constant external funding to survive. They begin to sustain themselves. And when that happens, the direction of money changes. Instead of flowing into Africa, it begins to flow out, not as loss, not as collapse, but as repayment, as obligation fulfilled, as contracts being honored. This is the moment we are witnessing right now, a transition that was always part of the design, but rarely explained to the public. Because for decades, Africa's story has been told in one direction only: money coming in. But very few prepared the world for what it would look like when that process reached completion. And now that it has, the reaction is uncertainty. Because a continent that builds is one thing, but a continent that completes and begins to pay back, that is something entirely different. So let me ask you something again, wherever you are listening from. If Africa is no longer in the phase of building, if it has entered the phase of operating and repaying, then what does that mean for the systems that were built around keeping Africa in a permanent state of need? But here is where the story takes a sharper turn. Because when the numbers finally caught up with reality, the world did not react the way you might expect. The moment that changed everything did not come with a loud announcement. It came quietly, through numbers. At first, only a few analysts noticed it. Then, reports began to circulate. Then headlines, carefully worded, almost hesitant, started to appear. Africa was no longer receiving more money than it sent out. Instead, the flow had reversed across comparable periods. The continent had shifted by tens of billions of dollars, nearly 52 billion, moving from net inflows to net outflows. Now, on the surface, that sounds alarming. Money leaving instead of entering. For many, that signals crisis. But look closer, and something doesn't add up. Because if this were truly a financial collapse, we would see panic. Currencies would fall sharply. Ports would slow down. Governments would scramble for emergency funding. But none of that happened. Instead, operations continued. Trade moved. Infrastructure functioned. Daily life, while still facing challenges, did not reflect a system in breakdown. And that is what made this moment so unsettling for observers. Because it didn't behave like a crisis. It behaved like a transition. The truth is, what those numbers represent is not money disappearing. They represent something much more precise. Repayments beginning, contracts activating, grace periods ending. For years, many of these infrastructure loans included delayed repayment schedules, time for projects to be built, time for systems to stabilize, time for revenue to start flowing. And now, that time has arrived. So money is moving. Exactly as planned. Not because Africa is losing control, but because Africa is fulfilling agreements that were signed years ago. And this is where the emotional tension begins to rise. Because the global financial system has been conditioned to interpret Africa in a very specific way. A place where money flows in. A place where needs are ongoing. A place where development is always in progress, but rarely complete. But what happens when that pattern breaks? What happens when Africa is no longer asking for more funding, but is instead meeting its obligations? That changes the narrative, and narratives are power. Because when a country, or a continent, can meet its financial commitments without immediate crisis, it signals something deeper: capacity, stability, control. And those signals are not always comfortable for systems that rely on leverage. You see, financial inflows often come with influence, conditions, negotiations, expectations. But repayments reduce leverage. They close doors that were once open. They remove urgency. And without urgency, the balance of power begins to shift. This is why the reaction has been so cautious. Not loud panic, but quiet concern. Because no one wants to say it directly. But the implication is clear. If Africa can move from receiving to repaying, then Africa is no longer operating from a position of dependency. It is operating from a position of participation, and participation changes the conversation. It means choices become possible. It means negotiations become more balanced. It means decisions are no longer driven by immediate financial pressure, but by long-term strategy. And that is a very different Africa than the one the world is used to. So the real tension in this moment is not about money leaving. It is about what that movement represents. A system completing its cycle, a continent stepping into a new phase, and a global structure adjusting to something it did not fully prepare for. So let me ask you again. If Africa is no longer defined by what it receives, but by what it can sustain and return, then who, exactly, is losing control of the narrative? And more importantly, what happens next when that control begins to slip? Now, let's take a step deeper, because when money changes direction, it doesn't just affect balance sheets. It reshapes behavior. It reshapes decisions. And over time, it reshapes power itself. For decades, Africa's position in the global system was defined by one consistent pattern. Incoming capital created urgency. Governments needed funding to build infrastructure, to stabilize economies, to respond to crises. And that urgency often came with trade-offs. Decisions had to be made quickly. Agreements had to be signed under pressure. Conditions had to be accepted, sometimes without full control over long-term outcomes. But when that urgency begins to fade, everything slows down. And in that slowdown, something important emerges. Choice, right now, across parts of Africa, especially in regions like the Sahel, where countries are redefining their economic direction. The shift from dependence to internal operation is beginning to change how governments think. Because when infrastructure starts generating its own revenue, it reduces the need for immediate external financing. And when that need is reduced, governments are no longer negotiating from weakness. They are negotiating from stability. That difference may seem subtle, but it is profound. It means policies can be shaped with longer timelines in mind. It means national priorities can take precedence over external expectations. It means development is no longer something that must be constantly justified to outside lenders, but something that can be directed internally. And that shift is already beginning to show. We are seeing stronger emphasis on sovereignty, more careful evaluation of contracts, greater attention to how resources are managed, processed, and retained within national economies. Because once a country realizes it can operate without constant inflow, it begins to ask a different set of questions. Not, how do we attract more funding? But how do we control what we already have? And that question changes everything. It changes how infrastructure is used. It changes how trade is structured. It changes how partnerships are formed. But perhaps most importantly, it changes how people perceive the future. Because for a long time, development in Africa was always described as something coming later, a promise on the horizon, a goal not yet reached. But when roads are completed, when electricity is stable, when systems are functioning day after day, that future begins to feel present. And when people begin to experience that shift in reality, expectations rise, accountability increases, pressure moves inward, toward governments, toward institutions, toward leadership. No longer just asking for help, but asking for results. This creates a new kind of internal dynamic, one where leadership is no longer judged only by promises, but by performance. And that can be both stabilizing and challenging. Because while reduced dependence increases sovereignty, it also increases responsibility. There is no longer an external system to absorb failure, no longer an immediate fallback of new inflows to cover gaps, which means every decision carries more weight. Every policy matters more. Every outcome becomes more visible. And this is where the transition becomes complex. Because moving from dependence to self-sustaining systems is not a smooth line. It is a process, one that requires discipline, coordination, long-term thinking, and in regions already facing security challenges, like Burkina Faso and its neighbors, this transformation is happening under pressure, balancing economic restructuring with ongoing security concerns, balancing sovereignty with stability, balancing independence with cooperation. So the question is no longer whether Africa can build. That phase is ending. The question now is whether Africa can manage what it has built, whether it can maintain stability without falling back into dependency, whether it can turn infrastructure into long-term economic strength, and whether it can do all of this while navigating a global system that is still adjusting to this new reality. Because when a continent begins to rely less on external support, it does not just change itself. It changes how everyone else must respond. So here is the deeper question. If Africa is becoming more self-directed, more stable, and more selective, then how will the rest of the world adapt to a partner that no longer negotiates from need, but from choice? Now, let's widen the lens, because what is happening in Africa right now is not just a regional shift, it is a global signal. For decades, the relationship between Africa and major powers, especially the United States and Western institutions, has followed a familiar structure. Financial support created influence. Loans opened doors to negotiation. Aid programs helped shape policy directions. And in many cases, urgency became leverage. When a country needs immediate funding, it has limited options. Decisions must be made quickly. Conditions become harder to resist, and influence becomes easier to apply. But what happens when that urgency begins to disappear? That is the question now facing policymakers in Washington and across Western capitals. Because an Africa that is no longer dependent on constant inflows is an Africa that negotiates differently. It asks different questions. It takes more time. It chooses more carefully. And that changes the entire dynamic. This does not mean the United States is losing its role in Africa. Far from it. The U.S. remains deeply engaged, economically, diplomatically, and strategically, especially in regions like the Sahel, where security concerns remain high. But the nature of that engagement is evolving, because influence built on necessity is not the same as influence built on partnership. And partnerships require balance. They require mutual interest. They require respect for sovereignty. At the same time, other global players are watching closely. China, having already established deep infrastructure ties, is now entering a different phase of its relationship with Africa. One based not just on building, but on long-term returns. Emerging powers are also stepping in, offering alternatives, creating a more competitive global environment around the continent. And in that competition, Africa's position is strengthening. Because when multiple actors are involved, and when dependence is reduced, choice expands. And in geopolitics, choice is one of the most valuable assets any nation can have. But with that opportunity comes uncertainty. Because a more independent Africa means a more complex global landscape, more negotiation, more competition, more unpredictability. So the real question is no longer whether Africa is part of the global system. It always has been. The question now is, on what terms? And if those terms are changing, could this be the beginning of a more balanced world? Or the start of a new kind of global competition that no one is fully prepared for? So now, we return to the question we asked at the very beginning. What does it really mean when money starts leaving Africa? Because, by now, the answer should be clearer. This is not a story of collapse. It is a story of transition. A transition that has been building quietly for years, hidden behind construction sites, buried inside contracts, and only now becoming visible through numbers. Africa is moving from a phase of dependency into a phase of operation. From receiving to sustaining. From being defined by need to being defined by capacity. And that shift changes everything. But here is where we must be honest. Transitions like this are never simple. They come with pressure. They come with risk. Because as Africa becomes more self-directed, it also becomes more responsible for its own outcomes. There is no longer room to hide behind unfinished projects. No longer space to delay difficult decisions. No longer the same safety net of constant inflows, which means the next phase will test something deeper than infrastructure. It will test leadership. It will test discipline. It will test whether sovereignty can be maintained, not just declared. And in regions like the Sahel, where countries such as Burkina Faso are navigating both security challenges and economic transformation, this test becomes even more intense. Because stability is not built in isolation. It must be protected while it is being constructed. So the question we face now is not about the past, not about how Africa was funded, not about who invested or who lent. The real question is about the future. Will Africa turn this moment into long-term strength? Will it protect its growing independence under global pressure? Will it redefine its place, not as a recipient, but as a strategic actor in the global economy? And perhaps most importantly, is the world ready for an Africa that no longer plays by the old rules? If you've been watching Africa over the years, if you've followed the headlines, the conflicts, the promises, then this moment deserves your attention. Because the biggest transformations don't always arrive with noise. They arrive quietly, through shifts that most people overlook. A change in direction, a change in flow, a change in expectation. And by the time the world fully understands what is happening, the balance has already changed. So stay informed, stay aware, and keep watching closely. Because Africa is not just changing, it is entering a new phase. And what happens next may define the future of the global system itself.